week my message revolved around the concept that the light of Christ had the power to shine through whatever darkness we faced in our lives. Because it does, we were reminded that we do not wander through that darkness alone. In fact, we are guided through that darkness with God at our side. While Isaiah does not directly refer to Jesus in his writings, he tells Israel that a Messiah, God's anointed one, would lead them through the darkness they felt descending upon them. However, the darkness Isaiah warns of is not the enemies Israel sees on their doorstep, but the enemy within. The enemy that was slowly taking them farther and farther away from their God. An enemy that, if not overcome, would lead them into a darkness of their own making. The enemy Isaiah warned of is sin. In the modern world, we don't like to hear that word. In fact, we don't like to hear that sin still has the power to lead us astray. We prefer to believe that in and through Jesus Christ, the power of sin has been vanquished forever. And that as long as we are good to one another, as long as we worship regularly, well, whatever regularly is, God will see that we are faithful, not sinful. And then we'll look beyond our shortcomings. Here's the thing. Being good to one another and gracing the pews we sit in with our regular use of them is not what keeps sin at bay. In fact, sin is in our midst. Here, now, in God's house. How many of us ever smile graciously at someone, pass the peace to someone who is here and then under their breath really despise the people they see because they don't see the world the same way we do? This is just as wrong today as it was back in the time of Isaiah and Micah. Now, Micah, who we hear in the Old Testament today, was a contemporary, a younger contemporary of Isaiah, preaching a message of impending judgment. He said, God's judgment is coming, not because Israel had fallen short, but because Israel had redefined sin in such a way that those things they did that once drove this wedge between them and God were now seen as shortcomings. Not rebellion, not disobedience, and definitely not unfaithfulness or let alone sin. At the heart of Micah's message is a truth Jesus will make known in a parable years later. It's not what we see on the outside that makes us clean or unclean. It is what is on the inside. And no matter how we wash the outside, we cannot make the inside clean on our own. Micah's condemnation, as you might expect, was not very well received. A long tradition of sacrifices and ritual had come to be seen as the cleansing instruments in and of themselves. People believed as long as they did these outward signs of faith that somehow they would be made right with God and right with one another. Today, some still believe that when we make our confession on Sunday in worship, we are immediately forgiven. Forgetting that confession, like the rituals and sacrifices of the past, only offers forgiveness when it is followed by a change of heart, a change in our lives. Seeking forgiveness time and again for something we are unwilling to change. Notice I said unwilling, not unable. Shows God that our efforts are really hollow. That's why Micah says that the Lord is not pleased by the endless and meaningless sacrifices Israel makes, but only in their acts of justice, love, and humility. That's something I think we still need to hear today. When we go through the motions just to look good, be it in God's eyes or in our neighbors', when we fail to respect one another, or we place our own interest ahead of those of God, those are not shortcomings. They are sin. Remember, sin by definition is anything that separates us from the love of God. Israel thought that if they redefined sin to this narrow degree of action, narrow, well-defined acts of disobedience, instead of God's overarching intent of the law, they'd somehow be seen as righteous. No, says Micah. It's about living faithfully on God's terms, not theirs, and definitely not ours. None of us wants to admit that our shortcomings could ever rise to the level of sin. But that is exactly what Micah says is happening to those who would hear him then and now. Our pride and our self-righteousness have clouded our perceptions of what is right, what is wrong. So much so that, like Israel, we believe the excuses we make that somehow elevate us one over the other. Acts of justice, love, and humility are no longer seen as ways to show grace, but to receive praise. This sense of self-importance, of entitlement that feeds the greed in our lives at the expense of others is part of what Jesus is addressing in the Sermon on the Mount. Israel, like today, had become a society of me-firsters. Whether they had a lot or a little really didn't matter. What mattered was it was theirs. What they forgot, what we forget, is that it is really God's. Like our doxology, that reminds us that all things, not just some things, but all things come of God. And that when we give to the glory of God and not ourselves. Israel had similar words to remind them of their duty to be faithful stewards of God's riches. Micah and Jesus call them and us out, telling us words are cheap. It is our actions that reveals our true natures. In Matthew's version of the Beatitudes, Jesus tells those with little, don't worry. Earthly treasures are transitory. What they will one day receive are heavenly treasures, treasures which are eternal. Seek, he says later, and they will find. Knock, and the door will be opened. Ask, and it will be given. But to those who have much, Jesus will say, much will be asked. Yet in the Beatitudes, he is telling those with much that what they have is of no real value. They are just as poor and destitute as those they look down their nose at. The only thing of value within reach, Paul will tell us, is one another. Unless we see one another as part of the body, the same body, then just as he told them and he tells us, we live with false hopes. We are in danger of missing one of the greatest gifts God can give. God's love. God's grace. Brothers and sisters in Christ, don't let the anger of the political issues of the day drive wedges between us and God. To do so invites sin into our lives and into our community. When we come here, we don't come as Republicans, as Democrats, or independents. We come as sinners, seeking the grace of God in our lives. Let the words we hear, the prayers we offer, the hymns that fill the space, the bread and wine we consume, not be simply acts of repetitive worship, but life-changing instruments that God uses to help reconcile our relationships with God and with one another. It may take time, and that's okay. Because along our journey, we know this: God is with us. And as we travel together, the unexpected blessings we find along the way might just surprise us, as it surprised all those who heard Jesus that day on the Mount, telling us, you are blessed. Amen.
Amen.